Hmm.
To everyone who's joining us, as before we begin, feel free to use the chat to introduce yourselves to the panelists and to each other, if you would like to do so. Thanks everybody for joining us. Tonight we are having a conversation with Jeremy Paul Kagan, the director of many films, including one that opened up in New York about 40 years ago. For those of you who don't know the plot, I assume most of the people on this conversation during this conversation are aware of it, but it's the story of two Jewish boys from very different backgrounds. It's about, the struggle between the secular and the sacred, assimilation or not. And it was based on a novel by Chaim Potok of the same name. And interestingly, it's 40 years since the film was made, and Jeremy Paul Kagan made the film it was about 40 years in the past where his film was set. So it's interesting kind of looking back on that as well. The film starred as the two boys, Robbie Benson and Barry Miller, and as the parents, two people, again, of very different sorts of backgrounds and ideas about how to raise children in a rapidly changing New York City, Maximilian Schell and Rod Steiger. Now, if you watch it now, this film, The Chosen, which I did last night, I watched it again, it feels like you're watching a classic, something that's always been there. But I think in some ways, other than films like, say, Hester Street, which came out a few years earlier, it represented sort of a new way of representing the Jewish experience on screen, like with this sort of nuance and sensitivity and the way it explored the details of the Jewish community, its religious aspects, its secular aspects, and those conflicts. Now, Jeremy will talk to us a little bit and about many of the films he's made. And I like watching his films because there's a variety of Jewish experience that's depicted throughout the films. You have Jewish detectives, you have Jewish bartenders, and yes, you have rabbis and rabbinical students. And some, in his films grow up to be, Prime Minister of Israel or lead the Yippie movement in the late 60s. So here's how this is going to work tonight. We're going to start with a couple clips from The Chosen, just to get us everybody in the mood. Then we're going to have a conversation about the film, and feel free to put all your questions into the chat. We'll get to as many of them as possible. Just so you know, this conversation is being recorded, so everyone who's a part of this panel, we will be emailing the recording to you after the event. And if you're looking for more events like this, such as one we're doing next week with the director Nicholas Meyer, you can just go to forward.com/events and find out everything that we're doing and everyone we're talking to. Now, this is the part of the discussion is if we were in an auditorium where the lights would go down, Jeremy Paul Kagan would appear and we'd all give him a big round of applause. Unfortunately, we don't have that capability here, but yes, thank you. And so we're going to start with a couple of clips and then we'll move to our conversation. Thank you, Jeremy Paul Kagan, for joining us, and thanks everybody for watching at home.
Glad to be here. It's an honor. Thank you all for taking the time. I don't know if the clip's going to start, but I'm going to take the poll out. Right.
We're getting slaughtered, and it's only the first inning.
Malta, you take over for Davey, okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay. Come on, Ruben. Give him the buzz bomb, Ruben.
Ball!
Hold on, Ruben. Hold on. Come on. Easy.
Ball 2.
All three.
This man was on a boat and fell into the sea, and the captain of the boat, he saw this man was drowning, so he threw this man a rope. And hold on to this rope, he shouted. Hold on to this rope, hold tight, because if you let go, you may lose your life. Are we too not drowning in the sea of ignorance, cruelty, death? Who is our captain? God.
And what is the rope that he throws us?
It is our Torah.
No, it's not an easy task to study Torah. It is a task that takes all day. It is a task that takes all night. And there is a great danger. Did not the Reb Meir say, he who is walking by the way and studying, and he breaks off that study, and he sees a field, and in that field he sees a tree. Him does not the scriptures consider as if he had forfeited his life. Only through the Torah. Through the Torah can you lead a full life. Only then will God, the master of the universe, only then will he hear your words. Amen.
Amen. The defendant, Abbott Hoffman.
Right.
Moving to a very different clip there with Abby Hoffman. But let's start by, when Rod Steiger gave that a performance and said Amen, were you tempted to say Amen at the when you were?
I'd be tempted to say it right now. I'm not sure. Are you seeing me? I want to make sure because I'm seeing you. I want to make sure you're seeing me as well. Yes.
I am seeing you.
Good. All right,
will tell us
now
if
we're
they're
seeing.
not seeing
I'm
you.
good. I'm good. By the way, the person we should be paying attention to is this guy up here. This guy. This guy here is the reason why we're all here. That's Chaim Potok. And he, of course, is the author of The Chosen. And this was me about 40 years ago. I think I was actually around 36 or 37 at the time, not quite 40. I asked Chaim to play a part in the movie, which he did. He played the Talmud teacher in the latter part of the film. But it is really, it's once, I remember a number of filmmakers talking about what do they feel what their job really is. And one of them said, well, essentially I'm an illustrator, like someone who does the drawings, because the story in this case, I didn't invent. The story was invented by, where's my finger to get the right position? There you go, by this brilliant man, Chaim Potok.
So how familiar were you with Potok's work and The Chosen before this whole project began?
Not at all. This is my own sort of ignorance at the time. I had not read the book. So I didn't know it was a masterpiece. I'd heard of My Name is Asher Lev, which is the next series. He did a couple of books about Asher Lev, but I hadn't read those either. And when years ago, and I do tell this story often because it's the truth, how one's life gets led is oftentimes not because you choose it, but because it's chosen for you. And you follow the path that's suddenly open, and sometimes we don't follow it. In my case, I'd gotten a copy of this script, as I've said, and I got the script about 3 years before I made it. I read this particular script, and I didn't think it was very interesting or very good, and I put it aside. 3 years later, the famous Landows, that's Edie and Eli Landau, they were famous New York producers, very daring people. They would do very controversial films and did a number of films about Jewish subjects, like The Pawnbroker, Man in the Glass Booth. Interesting, by the way, that's how they got Rod Steiger and Maximilian Schell to commit, because both of them were in those movies, or Max was in Man in the Glass Booth and Rod was in The Pawnbroker. Brilliant performance by both of them. And they committed to this movie, and I was sent a screenplay. And I read it that evening, very excited, because, I mean, my respect for these actors was gigantic, but also not just that, but also, my respect for these particular producers was really enormous. And when I read the script, I was saying to myself, I read this before. This is that same script. I don't understand. So I went out, and this time bought the book, realized the book was a masterpiece, read it in, I guess, a couple days. I'm a slow reader, and said, look, let me rework the script, and in many ways go back to where it was in the book. There were a couple scenes from the screenplay that I did keep, and then Gordon had sort of done that interpretation. And that was how we made the movie. So in a way, I was just becoming familiar with it. And, the greatest compliment to the movie that I've had in many ways was Chaim himself, who said, this movie has been translated into, 20 languages, and this is the best translation so far.
I'm not sure if you're able to read the chat as we're going, and perhaps you're not. One of your former collaborators has joined us this evening, a man named Henry Sapoznik, who played klezmer music with his band on the soundtrack. He is very pleased to be here. Yeah. And we welcome Henry.
Good to see you. Like to hear you.
Well, yeah, well, perhaps next time when we're in some sort of auditorium, we can do that. Right. So I'm curious how much. You grew up the son of a rabbi, a very different sort of rabbi than the one Rod Steiger plays in the film. But how personal was this film in terms of bringing your own experience to it?
In the sense that I say that I was, quote, chosen for it. Here's me, really a lot younger, and that's my dad, who was a Reform rabbi at Sinai Temple in Mount Vernon, New York. That was my bar mitzvah, and I grew up with. Obviously a rabbi as a father, but his pulpit was an activist pulpit. He was really socially responsible and responsive. He marched with clergymen down in the South in the 60s during the Civil Rights Movement. And he was constantly pushing his congregants to be active in fairness to everybody and in anywhere. And so his approach to, I think, religion, like many people's approach to Judaism in particular, was not orthodoxy. It was not kosher. It was not this, I will say, exclusive way of approaching existence, but it was much more inclusive. In fact, he was one of the first clergymen in New York State to actually get certified as a psychotherapist. And so he practiced that as well, and practiced that for his congregants who needed that kind of help, as well as a private practice. So that was all part of the world that I grew up in. And if you ask me, at that time, when I was having my bar mitzvah, or when I went to college as an undergraduate at Harvard University, if you asked me what a chassid was, I wouldn't have been able to say it like that. I wouldn't have been able to spell it, and I had no idea. In fact, I didn't know where Brooklyn was. I mean, you've got the Brooklyn Bridge behind you, but as far as I was concerned, Brooklyn was somewhere else. Might as well have been Minsk. We lived in Westchester. New York was where you went. And the whole idea of the Lower East Side, that was ancient history. So I knew nothing about Orthodoxy at all. My father did mention something, and I remember this quite well. When I was maybe, about this age or a little bit older, I'd heard of something called Kabbalah. I didn't know how to spell it or pronounce it either. And he immediately said, yes, this is something that's from our past. It's superstition. In those days, in fact, you had to know Torah backward and forward, and you had to be married, and you had to have children, and you had to have work, and then you could maybe study this stuff. But he just regarded it as unimportant. Because of making the movie, I personally got exposed to the principles of Kabbalah, and it literally changed my life. And I practice daily a number of meditative exercises that come out of Kabbalah and Abulafia and the Ari and some of these great sages at that time. I have a wonderful teacher, Rabbi Stephen Robbins, here in Los Angeles, who has been my teacher of Kabbalah. I mean, of course, Arya Kaplan, really. Those of you who know the work of Arya Kaplan. But if I hadn't made this movie, there I am again, that's Rod over there, Rod Steiger. If I hadn't made the movie, I wouldn't have known anything about that world, and it wouldn't have literally changed my life. So
how actually did it happen during the course of the making of the movie? Because there's not a whole lot of Kabbalah in the film.
None. What had happened was that Chaim was a friend of some of the people who were part of the Lubavitch group. I think actually the secretary of the Lubavitch, Krinsky, was a friend of Chaim Potok's. And Chaim, too, danced, as many of us do, on the edge of orthodoxy. I mean, Chaim did wear a yarmulke all his life, but, you know, his life was still, I wouldn't say he was totally kosher, and I wouldn't say he was, modern Orthodox. I would say he was in between, which is one of the reasons why he wrote these novels. Now, it's interesting, those of you who read the novel, remember that really the argument in the novel is between the ultra-Orthodox Hasidic small sect in Brooklyn during the late 40s, right, as the not mid-40s, as the war is going on, and a, quote, more modern Orthodox. Something we changed in the movie. We made our, the less Orthodox, we made him more, quote, conservative-like, and he doesn't wear a yarmulke all the time. So that we were getting to be a little bit more inclusive. And Chaim approved of that. But because in the book, it's really about two Orthodox worlds, two approaches to the Orthodox world. The movie is far more wider in the sense of the less Orthodox, less, if you will, disciplined and specific and in many ways limited. But the point is that I got exposed to the Hasidic world through the Lubavitch. In fact, I had the honor and privilege, and I didn't really understand it for years, of meeting Rabbi Schneerson, the Rebbe, at 3 o'clock in the morning, which was a common thing in those days. I didn't know that, but I was told that's, you know, people met him, he's a little late sleeper or early sleep riser or whatever. And that famous sort of look, he looks into your eyes and he looks through you and sort of knows all about you, and I wasn't ready for that. And then there's that famous exchange of a dollar bill, which I didn't even realize till many, many, many years later. The whole point was being given a gift so that you give a gift. Anyway, by being with the Lubavitch, as you know, the Lubavitch, even right now, Chabad are far more open. They are embracing. They welcome in. You don't have to be Orthodox. You don't have to be so strict in your behavior. We want you to come in and experience our lives. And that's exactly what happened. So I would spend time with leaders of the community and also with people who are Baal Teshuvas, returnees. These are oftentimes people who were, were into, like me at the time, drugs, sex, rock and roll, and Eastern religions. But we're finding that our own religion had a deep spiritual space and center, and that spiritual center is in fact represented by the thousands of years of Kabbalah being taught. And so I got exposed to it, and that began the cycle.
How did that change your approach to being a filmmaker, being exposed to that? Obviously, it changed your approach to religious practice, but was there an aspect of your filmmaking and the topics that interested you? Did that change as well?
Certainly, because of making The Chosen, and it happens with anybody in any art form. You make something that people recognize in some way, and then people come to you and say, can you make another version? And in fact, Chaim and I spent some time trying to get Asher Lev off the ground as a movie after this movie was done. But I was asked at various times to make movies that were specific about Jewish subjects, like Crown Heights. In fact, speaking of music, if you go to the forward and look at an article about Crown Heights, there's a connection to the music that was written at the end of that movie, which is one of the most beautiful pieces of music I think I've ever been associated with a movie. In fact, it won the Emmy Award that year. It's a spectacular sound that mixes gospel and Jewish prayer. Aaron Zygmunt, a fabulous composer, put that together for that movie Crown Heights. And as I said, there's an article forward that gives you a link to the music. But the idea was things like Crown Heights were offered to me because I'd made The Chosen. Things like Golda's Balcony years later, same thing. Someone came to me because they knew I was dealing with social of these kinds of subjects that had to do with Jews. And you know, in the same way, I've made a number of political films that are specifically about America and our sort of issues with fairness. And so Catherine is the story of a revolutionary girl who's rich who becomes a revolutionary during the late 60s, part of the Weather Underground. That led to movies like Both Heroes, which is about a returning veteran, Big Fix, which is about a Jewish detective. But they all are filled with dealing with the social and political issues of our time. Conspiracy, the trial of the Chicago 8, another example. So it's interesting. Those are sort of two of the worlds that I was oftentimes dealing with approach, because we made a good movie that people liked about this particular subject. Oh, he's good to make these social commentary movies. Made a good movie about the issue of Jews. Oh, he should make some Jewish movies. And I've been fortunate enough to make a number.
I want to read something that just came in the chat before it disappears, because someone remembers you from when you were a very small child. Ann Rasko writes, I remember Rabbi Kagan, who was our rabbi for many years. He was an activist.
Yeah.
Warm and wonderful memories. I remember when Jonathan and Jeremy were born and the excitement about their arrival, and it is so nice to see Jeremy. So that's Ann Rasko, remembering, perhaps was at your bar mitzvah as well.
Well, thank you. I'm so glad that you remember him as an activist. I'm so glad that's one of the words that you're applying to him.
What was your bar mitzvah speech? Do you remember?
No. I really. Do you remember yours?
I remember quoting a lot of people who I didn't understand. I do remember that. I remember Franklin Delano Roosevelt was quoted, but I don't remember much else.
Now that you've said it, I'm going to now have to track it down, but I don't remember. I do remember one of the things is I'd had a high soprano voice at the time still. And I remember I chanted. And what was interesting is the members of my father's congregation were very upset about it because nobody chanted. Everybody, sort of read. Chanting was what old Orthodox Jews did, but not what modern Reformed Jews did. And a number of his congregants were upset that, his son chanted.
I'm interested in learning that he was an activist rabbi. So obviously his character didn't necessarily inform the Rod Steiger character particularly, but the other character played by Barry Miller, his father certainly has a social consciousness and a sort of an activist approach. Did your father inform that character in any way?
What I feel is, for those of you who know the movie, there is a Rebbe who's a Hasidic Rebbe with a small community, and his son is going to be the next, the heritage. And his son wants to be, interesting in life, as I just mentioned about my dad, a psychologist. He does not want to take on the responsibilities of becoming the next Rebbe. He becomes befriended by that kid who hit him in the eye, or the other way around, he hit him in the eye with a baseball, and that's Reuven. And Reuven's dad is a Zionist, is a writer, is a contemporary in terms of both understanding culture, art, and politics. So he, in many ways, represented another side of my father. So I felt, strangely enough, that in a way, that, as I said, the movie Beshert, the idea of destiny, the idea of being chosen, the movie kind of said, you're the right filmmaker to make this. I know it's weird to say that, but it really feels to me that that's true. Because of who I am, because of the way I was raised, and because where I was in my filmmaking career, I was, able to work with stars. I think if this had been something earlier on in my filmmaking career, I don't know if I would have been able to work with Rod and Max. So the timing was right, and the subject matter was something that talked to me. And I'm so grateful that The Chosen chose me, because shifted who I am. And that's pretty amazing, because if you ask artists, and I talk to lots and lots of filmmakers. I've been lucky enough because I'm chairperson of what's called Special Project of the Directors Guild of America. And I've literally talked to hundreds of the greatest filmmakers in the world, from Guillermo del Toro to Steven Spielberg to Ang Lee to Catherine Bigelow to Wes Anderson. You name them, I've spent 3 hours with each of them, interviewing them about how they go about doing what they're doing. And I often ask, has something you made changed you? And in many cases, they'll talk about how it's changed them as artists, but they don't necessarily talk about them how it's changed their own lives, how they're taking another perspective on life. Some do, but in this case, there was just no question. This movie changed me.
Someone who I assume you're well acquainted with, named Jonathan Kagan, asks if you would speak to the father and son relationships in the film.
Well, he should. That's my brother, by the way. I had no idea he was.
Yeah, I kind of figured that.
I've been enjoying him.
He's not in one of these boxes, so it's going to have to be up to you.
We used to joke between each other that he's an ophthalmologist and quite brilliant at it, and actually, in the midst of shifting to more of a retired state, but he's quite brilliant in his knowledge about the eyes. And the game that we used to play with each other was, he'll fix your eyes and I'll give them something to look at. And I mean, what's fascinating is, and I don't know if you go through this with your own dad. I mean, our dad died young. Our dad died at 63 years old in 1969. So in many ways, I didn't get a chance to ask him questions that I'd like to ask him right now. I'd like to ask him what he really deeply felt about his own spirituality. I'd like to ask him because I've had a very, very profound experience. I had a near-death experience in my life that also changed me. I would like to ask him, what did he think about this idea of souls? And for those of you who know it, the idea of a neshama, and the idea is there such a thing as reincarnation? You know, and for an Orthodox Jew, you read a prayer at least twice a day that deals, among other things, with the concept of reincarnation. Not for a Reform Jew. I think that and it's interesting because my father, and I think my brother can testify this, never pushed sort of the religion upon us at all. I think what he wanted us to do was to ask our own questions, examine, who we are, look at our history, look at our cultural history as well as our political history. I think he, like many fathers, had admiration for his children and desired them to move to the next stage of existence. And you think about the grandparents being poor, then the next first generation oftentimes being professional, like our father as a rabbi, and the next generation sometimes bring into the world artists. So my father and mother both sort of encouraged me as I started to make film, and they didn't go through that process of, well, how are you going to make a living? And I think with my brother, it was much easier in many ways because they saw, he was going to be a professional doctor, which he became. But in the midst of it, as I said, my father never got to really see. He got to see an animated short movie I made that got a lot of attention, got a bunch of awards. And he did have this line, and I think he had that attitude about both his kids, that you do something well that I don't know how to do. And that's a great compliment from a parent.
And how does the pendulum go as a father as well? Have you brought people into the rabbinate or into the arts in your life?
Well, into the arts, yes. Into being Jews, maybe the movie has made some people want to examine their own Judaism. I hope it has. One of the things that a lot of us, I think, struggle with when you watch movies that have Jewish subject matter in it is that often they don't really they kind of judge it from the outside, sometimes with great sense of comedies, like Woody Allen would do it. But sometimes it are too precious. And I feel like because of the mastery of these two actors, because of the incredible writing that Chaim had, you got to know, particularly a Hasidic world, you got to know it as a real world of real people with problems that we all have. And even if they have specific behaviors, there was no judgment in those behaviors. Like, for example, that recent limited series that was on, very, very popular, about this Hasidic world and this girl who was trapped in the world. Almost every one of the characters in that particular Hasidic world is portrayed as evil. And the women as well. The husband is kind of pathetic, but that's it. And everybody is in a sense negative. Well, that's not the experience. Yes, of course, there are going to be people in this particular world that, in fact, do, in their exclusivity, actually do harm. And there are others that just are open-hearted. And one of the things that I experienced when I was with the Lubavitch community was how much care there was. And then that phenomenal thing that the Rebbe said, and those of you who are Chabadniks, you all kind of know this, or go to Chabad.org or whatever, they use media left and right. They have great films and videos and all, fabulous stuff. Why? Because the Rebbe said, if anything exists, then it can be used for kiddushim, for holiness, if anything exists. Or it can be used for negative. And it's the great line in Torah, which is, I set before you good and evil, choose you good and evil. That means we have a choice. That's where the chosen is, to have a choice. And the issue was, could you make a film about a Jewish subject? And could you use that media, or is it a distraction? And I, obviously, because I sort of grew up with the acceptance of movies as a potential art form, as well as a motivating form, as well as an entertainment form, it was great to sort of know that, this form is a way to communicate. So for some people who look at this movie, they may sort of examine their own Judaism. In terms of teaching, or in terms of the world of filmmaking, I've been teaching since 1989, and I became a full professor at the School of Cinematic Arts at USC in 2001. I still teach. I have classes tomorrow and Friday. So it's very much part of my world, is to help others develop their voice and their vision, and also do it in an ethical way. And I'm proud of people like, I'm going to mention one, because an early student, Sean Levy, who's made many, many feature films and television's Stranger Things is one of his series. And it's good to see that, that you can pass on skills that they can take, and in fact, even expand beyond where you were. That's, a teacher looks for the student to be better than the teacher.
I'm going to invite people once again, if they have questions, to put them in the chat. One question that showed up early in the chat, you're referring just now to the Netflix series Unorthodox, I believe, was the one that we're talking about.
Yeah.
And someone says, with the renewed interest in Orthodox communities, whether it's, exoticizing it or just interest in it, has there been any interest in remaking The Chosen? Have you been approached? Somebody wants to know.
Making The Chosen again? I'm not quite sure of the question. Well, no. But I did have the experience, and some of you may know this. This is, by the way, our crew, and when we made the movie. I think the Landos are there somewhere over my left shoulder. But yeah, they are right in the corner. What was interesting is that a group decided to make a musical out of what I thought was the book, and it turned out they wanted to make a musical out of the movie. And it was in a Lower East Side theater, famous theater on 2nd Avenue. And I remember they called me and said, could I come in and see it? And it was before it was about to even have previews. And I came to see it, and from my point of view, it was a compliment that they were copying the movie, but also from my point of view, it wasn't very good. And it was sort of too late to be able to sort of say, you know, if you took this scene and put that there and you pulled this out and maybe you want to rewrite some of this music. And I think it did have a run in New York and maybe some other places, but no. As I said, I was approached a number of times to do other work by Chaim Potok, and it would have been great to have done Nasher, but no.
I'm also curious, like one of the conversations that is had a lot now is, you know, the appropriateness of casting non-Jewish actors in Jewish roles.
Sure.
So we have Maximilian Schell, we've got Rod Steiger. Was that a consideration for you at the time, or were you just happy to have these great actors in these roles?
Well, there's no question. I was thrilled to be able to work with these actors because these are two of the great actors of my time and film time. And what was interesting was that issue, which is now a much bigger issue than it was, the idea of, you know, diversity and inclusiveness, and recognizing you don't want to be co-opting another culture, is a big deal now. And it's interesting because I just finished, I'm going to go back to it, but I'll give you an example. I just finished making 2 shorts to encourage the Latinx and the African-American communities to take the vaccines, because particularly in the Los Angeles area, their statistics are much lower than other groups. But what I realized, even though the people approached me and said they wanted me to be the filmmaker to do that, I said, no, we can't do that anymore. I will put together and supervise, so make sure the films are good, but I will put together a Latinx crew and a writer and director from the group that I've worked with as students at the School of Cinematic Arts, and also an African-American one, which I did. And they made the pieces, they wrote it, they directed it, and again, I supervised and helped them through the process. But at this time, it would have been totally inappropriate for me to have been the filmmaker making those pieces. Back then, 40 years ago, different time. But more important is another question, which is a deeper question, and it's a controversial question now. And it's funny because Theo Bickel became a friend of mine. I met him actually at an event that we were doing for, I think it was the 33rd anniversary of the State of Israel, and it was an opening of The Chosen at Radio City and about 50 other cities to raise money. I think they raised around $5 or $6 million that evening for Israel. And there was also a short that was made that I made with lots of artists performing, and Theo was one of the artists who performed it. And that's how we met, and we became good friends. And he wanted to play the part of the Rebbe, and he was a really good actor and would have made an interesting part. But you think we got the right actor? And Theo said you did, and that's Rod. Yes, Rod was not a Jew, and although he spent good time in Israel, neither was Max. Does that mean they shouldn't have played these parts? Well, here's something that I know, and it's a challenging one, but it's a spiritual one, and it is this: that inside every single human being, and I teach this to my students, and particularly my acting students, inside every human being is the existence of the idea that anything any human being has ever done, the most sacrificial, giving, generous action of any human being, as well as the most evil, cruel, and selfish action, exists within all of us. We are capable of becoming, Attila the Hun, or Jesus and Buddha. Moses, I'll leave out. But of course, they're all within us. And in a strange way, biochemically, they're within us because we're breathing the same air. The air that anybody breathed in any time is the air, because it just doesn't dissolve. Those atoms are still here, is in us. So what I say is that any human being, the bad and the good, is in you. Now, for an actor, what that means is they have to find that character that they're playing within them. And it exists. And the work of an actor is that homework to find that character. So can actors with an incredible capacity of self-investigation and creation, like Rod Steiger and Max Schell, play Jews? You bet.
I'm going to go through a few of these that we have shown up in the chat. You cast Robbie Benson in the role of Danny Saunders. Somebody asks, how did that happen? And somebody else asks, did you ever consider anybody else for that role? Or was it obvious that it was him?
No, it was not obvious at all, and I did. In fact, it was easier to cast Reuben because Barry Miller came in, and when he did the reading, the audition, he was so good. I was so excited, except he looked like a kind of almost a bum with torn T-shirt and jeans, and I thought, I can't present him to the Landows that way. They're just going to, not take him seriously. So I said, you have to meet the Landows, the producers, to get the approval, because I've approved you, I want you, but you got to clean up. So he put on a T-shirt and a jacket. He borrowed a jacket from a friend, and he went in to meet the Landows, and he knew all about their movies. And he just snowed them in a meeting, and they said, yeah, this kid's going to be fine. Finding the part that the son of the Rebbe, that was much, much more difficult, because the guy has to be incredibly intelligent, very physical, and have a kind of internal, almost self torture that also is a judgment of other people because of his incredible superiority, both physically and mentally. That's a complex character. And we kept looking, and there was an actor who was on Broadway, a new young actor who was not Jewish, that I thought about, named Eric Roberts. And in fact, Eric and I worked in 2 movies many, many years later. But I was very excited that it might happen. But he was so into this Broadway play, he couldn't even consider doing anything else. And he was young. So I just didn't have them. I was back in Los Angeles now. And I get a call from, this is a story I've told before, but it's a good one, so I'll tell it again. I should make it up it different, but it came this way. I got a call from his agent saying he'd like to read for the part. And he'd already was sort of a young teenage star, and there were a couple of movies he'd been in. He was kind of a heartthrob. And the movies he'd been in, he played very gentle, loving characters. And I said, I don't think he has the kind of rage that this character has. I think he's wonderful, but I don't think he's right for it. So I get another call. Can he please meet you? I'm thinking, what am I going to do? This isn't. Okay, sure. But I'm actually leaving for New York in a couple of days to continue auditions. He has to come to my house. So it's late afternoon. I get a knock on the door. I open the door, and this guy suddenly just comes right at me, and he grabs a hold of my lapels, and he throws me back against the wall. And he gets his face right next to me, and he says, "Is that enough rage for you?" Well, I was kind of terrified, and I said, "Yeah, you're Robbie Benson, right?" And I cast him. But it was, if those of you who know in the background the word chutzpah, real chutzpah on his part, and that's how he got the part. He went after it.
I think some other directors might have that might have lost him the part with some other directors, I would think.
Well, it was so daring that I knew, and then once he let go and we looked at each other, I knew that he knew that what I wanted to see was the internal quality of this character externalized, so that I know that he could then pull it back in. And so he showed it to me. I mean, he showed it to me in a way that was, as I said, it was incredibly audacious and daring. And I thought, well, this guy's got it. And, among other things, he's very, very physical. Really, Robbie's a very good athlete, and Robbie's incredibly smart. So it all that played into his capacity to create this character.
Given the tensions in the plot and the tensions between the characters, how tense was the set during the making of the film?
Well, I think you can get a sense of who I am, and a director sort of sets the atmosphere of a picture. So one thing is my enthusiasm and my excitement, and so that was always as coming on the set and really being, again, excited about what we were going to do that day. And I think that got communicated. I had some incredibly gifted people like Arthur Ornitz, who was the cinematographer, famous American cinematographer. And we didn't have very much money to make this movie. And I remember saying to Arthur at one time, Arthur, I want the images in the Hasidic world to look like these Rembrandt paintings. And I showed him a bunch of Rembrandt paintings, and Arthur goes, no, okay, fine. So, when we're shooting a particular sequence, going inside, I walk inside, and there's one light bulb, and I go back to Arthur and said, Arthur, are we lit? And he said, sure, you want Rembrandt? That's going to give you Rembrandt. And those of you who look at the movie, and even in the video that you just showed, I mean, it's dark and it has that kind of warmth. So I had an incredible group of people working with me, and they were enthusiastic about it. New York was enthusiastic. We couldn't have made the movie in New York City, where I said we can't go to Canada, if New York hadn't made a whole series of deals. So that there was a kind of genuine excitement about, this is a different kind of movie. So that was the mood of it. Interestingly enough, the acting styles of Robbie, who's over here, and Barry were very, very different. Barry's an improvisational actor, and Robbie is a far more studied actor, different acting styles, and I understand both of them and communicated them. Sometimes that would cause conflict between the two because they were just different kinds of styles. So that had to be mediated. But because they both trusted me, and because I admired both of them enormously and knew how to talk to them both in terms of the acting styles they had, they were able to give this performance that allows you to feel the connection of these two characters. We shot in a very short time. I think it may have been 28 days or something like that, when for a movie is not very much time. So there was always a kind of pressure. But there was also fun. I remember the one sequence that was in that very original script that Gordon had written by him, which I kept. I rewrote it, but it was a scene which was a wedding scene. And, we were out on the streets of New York City. We shot in the summer. In fact, we shot in the summer. It was so hot that on the first day, we had people in that baseball scene, which is what you just saw. People were falling from the heat. It was that hot. But, we were there and we were celebrating, and there was a live band that maybe Sposnik's band was right there. It had this kind of energy of some joyousness that we were all sort of feeling. It was like we're at a fun wedding, and then it's a Hasidic wedding, and the women are on one side, the men are on. Then they, this thing what they do with the chairs, where they lift the chairs up so you can see the bride and groom on both sides of the fence that was right behind us. So yeah, I feel like and I've been on many sets, and many of my own sets, and some have been had that greater tension. This one, I think, there was just an enthusiasm that now I didn't know whether the movie was going to be good. I mean, I know the book was great, but I didn't know if the movie was good. I knew these actors were wonderful, but I still, who knows? And when you're making a movie, you get very, very close to it. So close that oftentimes you can't see it. I remember there's my editor was John Garfield, the famous actor, was John Garfield's son, and David Garfield. And we were in the editing room with that last scene where the father and son, or sons in this sense, are talking to each other, and the father sort of explains why he's raised this son so harshly in terms of what this kind of silence that he talks about, where there's a distance between father and son. And it's a wonderful, wonderful scene, and Chaim had written a fabulous scene. But there was about like a 4-page dialogue in the book. There was no way that could happen in the movie, and I'd written it, and I kept on rewriting it. And I remember Rod, having to learn lines the night before, but he was totally committed to it. And there was something about the magic of the moments where things would happen that were unexpected, because they just were so truthful. And in the editing room, I was very worried because this still was a long scene. And I got in there, I said, we've got to start cutting and making it shorter and, cut back to the boys and do editorial things to, give it a little more kind of energy. And David said, Jeremy, you're a really good filmmaker. Get out of the editing room. What? Get out of the editing room right now. Trust what you've done. So I stepped away and came back, I don't know, maybe the next day to look at it. And I realized, of course, Rod had done a phenomenal job. There was no reason to cut away from him except for get a couple reactions the boys were appropriate. So it was this constant kind of live thing. And, we didn't, when the movie was done, and it had this screening at Radio City. It was an amazing experience to have a screening at Radio City. We didn't have the Rockettes, but we had a lot of Hasidic Jews. In fact, I was very worried how they would react to it. But what happened was 2 studios saw the picture, Columbia Pictures and 20th Century Fox. And I was told through the Landos, they wanted to distribute it because it was made independently. It was not made by studios, an independent movie. That was fabulous, to be distributed by them. That was great. We got that message on a Thursday. On a Monday, got calls from the 2 studios, not going to distribute it. Why? Because they said, there are this many Jews in America. There's this percentage of people that actually go to the movie theater. So if you take that percentage of Jews times the cost of going to the movie and the cost of distribution, they aren't going to make the money. Now, what was interesting is that the book was a giant success back in 1967, not because Jews read it. In fact, the people who owned and bought the rights to the book were actually a bunch of Methodists from New Orleans. That's where I got that first script, and they paid for that. Non-Jews. And in fact, what happened later was there was this very small distribution company that saw the movie because the movie had won a bunch of prizes at various film festivals, and they decided to distribute it. And they opened it up in a theater in New York and a theater in LA. And it played for months in those 2 theaters. And that's when 20th Century Fox came back and said, oh, I see. Not just Jews are watching this movie. We'll distribute it. And they did for a while.
So we've just got about maybe 5 minutes or so, a little more left. You talked a little bit about the end of the film, and I see a question here where somebody asks you, how actually realistic do you find the ending to be between Danny and his father when Danny has moved from the Hasidic path? What the questioner says is, like, if you made that film today, then the community might consider the son estranged, if not dead, which is not at all what happens in the film. Do you?
First of all, I think it was even an issue when we were making the movie. So it's a very astute observation. When somebody leaves the sect, how are they going to be treated? And in the case of the Danny, he cuts off his payas. He clearly is going to be much more of a contemporary. Maybe he will or will not wear his yarmulke. We don't know because he's got a hat on. But he's asked by his father, "Will you be a Jew?" And his father means by that, will you, keep to the commandments of a Jew? I don't know if he means all 613, but he certainly means, I think, in fact, he does mean that, even though you're not going to do it as a Hasidic individual would do it, or a member of this particular Hasidic sect. There was a real discussion about how this all would work. There was a discussion, by the way, should we even have payas on the boys when we made the movie? Because we're thinking, that's so off-putting. People don't want that. Those of you who read the article, the forward, and see a link, you'll see a link to a scene that was cut from the movie. Very, very much I objected to being cut, but if you look at the article in the forward about this, you'll see a link and you can watch this little scene because it's a scene when the Rebbe he takes the Torah out and everybody comes and kisses it. Well, for the non-religious Jews who were involved in making this movie, that's too weird. You can't do that because it'll make people think poorly of being Jewish. Now, from the Orthodox side and the Hasidic side, the idea of cutting off payas, that's a big deal. And there was a real discussion how people would feel about it. And it was interesting when the Hasidic Lubavitcher group came to see the movie at Radio City Hall. People I talked to and helped, you see the end of the movie, the boy cuts off, and I could sense that, we got still an issue even now. They know that's not going to happen. And I got a call from one of the younger rabbis and said it was a call, and he was saying to me on the phone next day, the Rebbe's very upset. And I thought, what? They told him about the movie, the payas being cut, and the Rebbe just said, wrong. I take a deep breath, and I'm feeling really, really badly. And then they said, the Rebbe is actually very concerned about young people, and he's decided to have a Sefer Torah made, and every letter is going to be sold for $1. And we heard you had a child, and I did. She was born a year before we made the movie. And the Rebbe wanted to know if you would like to have one of the letters in that Torah. Well, I felt as I tell the story that, in fact, that was a good review. That was an acceptance of the fact that the boy may leave the sect, but wasn't leaving Judaism. And I think today, the same, as the person is saying, that would still be an issue, and an issue worth talking about. Can you be a Jew and not keep all these 613 or whatever the number is possible to keep outside of Israel? And it's a real question. And obviously it's something for all of us to discuss. I feel like the idea of one thing that I'll share with you is the idea of Shabbos is an enormously powerful idea, that for 24 hours you shift your consciousness into a spiritual realm and recognize that you're a spirit or a soul inside your body and ego. Can we keep Shabbos for 24 hours in the way it's supposed to be? Well, no. Can you do a version of it? You bet. And I feel like we're all on the road. Some are further down, and some are further, back, but we're still on that same road by acknowledging we're Jews and acknowledging the gifts of being one.
Well, you know how to end a film, and you also know how to end a Q&A and discussion. That seems like the place we should leave it. Someone asked in the chat where they can watch The Chosen. I watch it on Amazon.com, Amazon Prime. There may be other places as well. Also, so we're going to send an email to everyone who attended this event that expresses, our thanks and an offer to subscribe at a discount and a link to this conversation so you could watch it again and again and again. And remember the questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to everybody's questions, but
I want to add one thing.
Everyone.
I want just to add one thing. You're going to be with Nick Meyer, who's a friend of mine, and I gave Nick his very first writing job as a writer for movies. So it's continuity. You asked about that. Anyway.
Which was what? What was that film?
It's called Judge D. It's a fascinating, and in fact deals with the ethnicity problem, because I think neither of us at this particular time would have ever been able to be involved in it. But that was back in the 1970s, and it's a wonderful detective story set in the Tang Dynasty in China. But say hello to Nick.
Anyway, thank you so much. I shall join our discussion. Put a Q&A in the chat.
There you go.
Thank you again for joining us. You can read Jeremy's articles for the Forward on forward.com, and he will have some illustrated Torah portions up on forward.com as soon as I have a chance to get them up there, probably in the next few days or a week or so. So thank you everybody for joining. Thank you, Jeremy, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you all. Stay safe and stay sane.